There is a powerful, living history in these mountains, a story of hardship, beauty, and an unbreakable spirit forged in the darkness deep beneath the earth. Welcome, dwellers of the dark, to Nocturnal Nightmares TV. Tonight, we journey into the hollows and forgotten company towns of Appalachia, where the mines may be sealed, but the legends are not. These are not just ghost stories. They are echoes of resilience, born from tragedy and loss. They are the spectral energy left behind by men who punched their time cards and never clocked out. Listen closely to the whispers from the deep. The first legend comes from a place they used to call Coldest Hollow. Story 1. The Whistle Pig's warning. My granddaddy, Silas, was a coal miner for 40 years. He was a man carved from the mountain itself, all hard lines and quiet strength. He died in his own bed at the age of 87, but he'd tell you with a grim certainty that he'd already died a dozen times in the belly of Black Creek Mine number 3. He just never stayed dead. The reason, he'd say, was the whistle pig. Now, out here, a whistle pig is just another name for a groundhog. But to the miners of Coldest Hollow, it meant something else entirely. It was the name they gave to the phantom of a young breaker, boy who'd been killed in a gas explosion in the 1920s. A boy who, they said, still walked the tunnels, whistling a high, mournful tune, as a warning of impending doom. I grew up hearing these stories. A piece of local folklore I filed away with tales of Mothman and the Bell Witch. To me, it was a ghost story, a way for old men to explain away the creaks and groans of a dying mountain. It wasn't until I took a job as a safety inspector, years after the mines had closed, that I learned the truth. My job was to survey the sealed entrances of the old mines, checking for erosion and methane leaks. It was lonely, quiet work. The sealed mines were like tombs, their concrete and steel doors a final, silent testament to a way of life that had been buried. One crisp October afternoon, I was inspecting the seal on Black Creek Mine number 3, my granddaddy's old stomping grounds. The entrance was a gaping concrete scar on the mountainside, the air around it still carrying a faint, metallic temps of coal dust and something else. Something that smelled like old, deep-seated fear. As I was taking methane readings, I heard it, a faint, high-pitched whistling. It was a simple 3-note tune, repeated over and over, and it seemed to be coming from inside the mountain, from the other side of the thick concrete seal. My blood ran cold. The legend, the whistle pig. My rational mind kicked in immediately. It had to be the wind, a freak acoustic phenomenon caused by air escaping a fissure in the rock. It had to be. I packed up my equipment, my hands shaking slightly, and tried to laugh it off. But the sound, so clear and so profoundly sad, followed me all the way back to my truck. The next day, I had to go back to finish my report. The whistling started the moment I stepped out of my truck. It was louder today, more insistent, the same 3 mournful notes echoing from deep within the sealed mine. It felt less like a random noise and more like a desperate, urgent communication, a warning. I remembered my granddaddy's words. When you hear the whistle pig, you get out. You don't ask why, you just run. But the mine was sealed. The danger was long gone, buried under 1,000,000 tons of rock and earth. What could it possibly be warning me about? I forced myself to ignore it, to focus on my work. Calibrated my senses, checked the seal's integrity. Everything was normal. No methane spikes, no structural stress. The whistling continued, a constant, mournful backdrop to my work. Then I noticed the silence. Just like in my granddaddy's stories, the woods around me had gone completely quiet. No birds, no insects, not even the rustle of leaves. The world had gone mute, except for that one piercing whistle from inside the tomb of the mountain. A primal fear, cold and sharp, gripped me. I looked up at the mountainside above the mine entrance, and I saw it, a long, jagged crack, thin as a hair, snaking its way down the rock face directly above the concrete seal. A stress fracture, and as I watched, a fine trickle of dust and pebbles spilled from it. The warning wasn't about the mine. It was about the mountain above the mine. The decades of blasting, the hollowing out of its guts, had finally taken their toll. The whole damn cliff face was unstable. The whistling grew frantic, the 3 notes repeating faster and faster, a shrill, desperate alarm. I didn't hesitate. I dropped my equipment and ran. I sprinted back towards my truck, my lungs burning, the whistling a high, piercing shriek at my back. I threw myself into the cab, fumbled with the ignition, and slammed the truck into gear. As I sped away down the gravel road, I looked in my rearview mirror, and I saw the mountain give way. It didn't crumble. It collapsed. 1,000,000 tons of rock and earth came crashing down in a deafening, thunderous roar. A cloud of dust and debris completely obliterating the mine entrance, my equipment, and the spot where I had been standing just moments before. I sat there, a mile down the road, my body trembling, the roar of the landslide still echoing in my ears. The whistling was gone. The silence was absolute. I finally understood the truth of the legend. The whistle pig wasn't a ghost of a dead boy. It was something else. It was the collective intuition of a generation of men who had lived and died by the mountain-s whims. It was the shared psychic memory of every miner who had ever felt a subtle shift in the air, a change in the pressure, and known in his bones that it was time to get out. It was a benevolent spirit born of shared danger, a legend that had fostered a strange sense of comfort and guardianship in a place that offered none. It was a story they told themselves, not just to scare the new boys, but to remind them to listen to the whispers of the deep, to the warnings of the earth, and to the high, mournful whistle that was not just a ghost, but the very soul of the mountain itself, still looking out for its own. Story 2. The Shadow in the Trestle. The old blackwood trestle bridge stands like a skeleton's ribcage over a deep, dark ravine. A monument to a railroad that no longer runs and a coal town that no longer exists. They call the ghost that haunts it the Shadow Man, and the legend is a stark reminder of the immense human cost that built this region. They say he est the spirit of a railway brakeman who was crushed in a coupling accident in the 30s, or maybe a miner who, broken by black lung and poverty, took a final desperate leap from the highest point of the bridge. Whatever his origin, the story is always the same. On moonless nights, you can see his tall, gaunt figure walking the length of the trestle, and sometimes you can see him jump, a silent, repeating echo of his final despair. As a teenager, that story was just a local thrill, a place to take a date and scare her into holding your hand. It wasn't here until I started working as a paramedic in these hollows that I learned the true, chilling weight of the legend. We got a call one night at 10 to 50, a car crash, down on the winding road that passes directly under the Blackwood trestle. It was a bad one. A single car had lost control on a curve and slammed into the stone bridge abutment. The driver, a young man, was pinned, his life bleeding out onto the asphalt. We worked frantically, the jaws of life groaning as we tried to peel the car open. My partner, Dale, a veteran who had seen more than his share of death in these mountains, was unusually quiet, his face pale and grim in the flashing red and blue lights. He kept glancing up at the trestle looming above us in the darkness. "You ever feel like we're being watched here?" he muttered, his voice low. I was too focused on the patient to pay him much mind. "It's just the bridge, Dale. Gives everyone the creeps." But he was right. I did feel it. A heavy, oppressive sense of sorrow. A coldness that had nothing to do with the night air. It felt like the entire ravine was steeped in a profound, ancient grief. We finally got the driver free, but it was too late. He was gone. As we were working on the grim task of recovery, Dale suddenly stiffened, his eyes wide, his gaze fixed on the trestle above. "Sweet Mother of God," he whispered. I followed his gaze, and I saw him. Silhouetted against the faint, stardusted sky was a figure, a tall, impossibly thin man, standing at the center of the bridge. He was perfectly still, a stark black cutout against the night. He wasn't a shadow. He was a void, a place where the stars were. As we watched, horrified, he took a single slow step forward and vanished over the edge. We didn't hear a scream. We didn't hear a body hit the ground. He just jumped, a silent, gut-wrenching reenactment of a suicide from a century ago. A wave of nausea and vertigo washed over me. Did you see that I stammered? Dale just nodded, his face ashen. "Every time," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Every damn time we have a fatal one on this road, he shows up. He's a harbinger, an omen." I tried to rationalize it, a trick of the light, a shared hallucination brought on by the stress of the scene. But the image was burned into my mind. The feeling of that profound, crushing despair was still clinging to the air. A few years later, I was on a call for a different kind of tragedy. An elderly man, a retired miner, had passed away in his sleep at his small home, not far from the trestle. It was my job to make the official pronouncement. The house was filled with his grieving family. As I was filling out the paperwork in the quiet living room, I noticed an old framed photograph on the mantel. It was a group of miners from the 1940s. their faces smudged with coal dust, their expressions grim, and in the back row stood a man who made my blood run cold. He was taller than the others, painfully thin, with a long, gaunt face and eyes that seemed to hold all the sorrow of the world. It was him. It was the face of the Shadow Man. I asked the man's granddaughter about the photograph. "Oh, that's my great-uncle Elias," she said, her voice soft with inherited sadness. "He worked the mines, but his heart was never in it. He saw too much," she said, "too many accidents, too much poverty. He developed what they used to call miner's melancholy. One night, he just walked out of the house and never came back. They found his coat folded neatly at the edge of the blackwood trestle the next morning. They never found him. I stared at the photograph, at the face of the man whose silent, desperate fall I had witnessed years ago. The legend was all wrong. The Shadow Man wasn't the ghost of some anonymous brakeman or a random miner. He was Elias, a man so broken by the grief and despair of his time that his own sorrow had become a permanent, living scar on the landscape. He wasn't a malevolent spirit. He wasn't a harbinger of doom. He was a manifestation of collective grief, a lingering echo of the immense human cost that had built this place. He showed up at accidents, not to foretell death, but because the presence of fresh tragedy resonated with his own eternal, looping despair. He was a stark, silent reminder of the mental health challenges, the crushing poverty, and the profound sadness that this land had soaked up like a sponge. And his silent fall wasn't a curse. It was a memorial, a quiet, heartbreaking monument to all the forgotten souls who had been swallowed by the shadow of the mines. Story 3. The Weeping Woman of the Coal Dust in the Hollows of West Virginia. There are stories that are told not around campfires, but in hushed tones in the kitchens of old women. Stories that are part of the very air you breathe. The story of the Weeping Woman of Blackwater Mine is one of those. They say she's the ghost of a miner's wife named Sarah, whose husband and 2 young sons were killed in a methane blast in 1912. They say she waited at the sealed mine entrance for 3 days and 3 nights, calling their names until her voice was gone and her mind was broken. And they say that on nights when the fog rolls in thick, you can still hear her, a faint, desperate weeping that seems to come from the earth itself, a sound that will chill you to the very marrow of your bones. I grew up in the shadow of the old Blackwater mine, and the story was my boogeyman. As a child, I was terrified of the fog, convinced that every swirling wisp was Sarah, come to mistake me for one of her lost boys. As I got older, I dismissed it as a sad but harmless piece of local folklore, a way to personify the grief of a community that had seen more than its share of tragedy. It wasn't until I became a historical preservationist, tasked with documenting the very ruins of our town's past, that I learned the horrifying truth. My project was to photograph and map the remains of the Blackwater mining operation, the crumbling tipple, the collapsed company store, and the sealed mine entrance itself. The entrance was a place of profound sadness, a crude stone archway filled in with concrete, a permanent tombstone for the men who had died inside. A small, weathered plaque listed their name. Among them, Thomas, Samuel, and Jacob Millers, Sarah's husband and sons. One evening, I stayed late, hoping to capture the ruins in the eerie light of the setting sun. As dusk began to bleed into night, a thick, cold fog rolled down from the mountains, swallowing the hollow in a blanket of grey. The world grew silent, the air heavy and damp, and then I heard it, a faint, heartbroken sobbing. It was a woman's voice, raw with a grief so profound it felt like a physical weight. It seemed to come from all around me, a disembodied sorrow carried on the fog. My heart hammered against my ribs. Sarah, the weeping woman. My childhood fear came rushing back, cold and sharp. I fumbled for my camera, my hands shaking, not to take a picture, but to use its bright, modern flash as a weapon against the darkness. I started backing away towards the old access road, my eyes darting into the swirling fog, expecting to see an apparition at any moment. The weeping grew louder, more desperate. It was closer now, coming from the direction of the sealed mine entrance. A flicker of movement in the fog. I froze. A figure was beginning to resolve itself in the gloom, standing directly in front of the concrete seal. It was a woman, her form hazy and indistinct, her head bowed as if in prayer or despair. I could see no features, just the silhouette of a woman in a simple, old-fashioned dress. I should have run, but a strange, professional curiosity mixed with a deep, empathetic sadness held me in place. This was a historical event, playing out in front of my eyes. This was the legend made real. The figure raised a hand and pressed it against the cold, damp concrete of the seal. The weeping intensified, a sound of pure, soul-shattering agony. And then something impossible happened. The concrete began to change. Where her hand touched it, the solid grey surface seemed to soften, to become porous. It turned dark, almost black, and began to crumble away, not like stone, but like dry, compacted soil. A fine, black dust began to trickle from the spot, a dust that looked unnervingly like coal dust. Her weeping grew into a full-blown, desperate wail, and the concrete seal began to disintegrate, a growing black hole of dust and decay spreading from her touch. I finally understood. The legend had it all wrong. Sarah wasn't a harmless, sorrowful echo of the past. She wasn't just a sad ghost, weeping for her lost family. She was a force, an entity of pure, concentrated grief, so powerful that it could physically erode the barrier between the world of the living and the tomb of the dead. She wasn't just mourning her family, she was trying to get them out. For over 100 years, her sorrow had been slowly, patiently, grinding away at the stone, trying to open the mine to bring her boys home. My terror was absolute. If she succeeded, what would come out of that mine with them? What would a century of darkness and trapped despair do to the spirits of those men? The air grew thick with the smell of coal dust and something else, a deep, earthy scent of decay. The hole in the seal was the size of a dinner plate now, a gaping maw of blackness from which a chilling, unnatural draught was beginning to flow. I turned and fled, not looking back, the sound of the weeping woman's triumphant, horrifying wail chasing me through the fog. I didn't stop until I reached the town, bursting into the local tavern, my clothes damp, my face a mask of terror. The old men at the bar just looked at me, and in their eyes I saw not surprise, but a deep, weary resignation. They knew, they had all heard the stories, they had all felt the sorrow, but no one had ever been there to see what her weeping could actually do. I never went back to the Black Water Mine. I quit my job the next day. But sometimes, on foggy nights, I swear I can still hear her, even miles away, her faint, desperate cry. And I know that one day she will succeed. One day her grief will be strong enough, and the thing that has been patiently answering her calls from the other side of the stone will finally be free. Story 4. The Ghost Lights of Black Mountain. The phenomenon of the Black Mountain. Ghost Lights is a cornerstone of our local lore, a story that bridges the gap between the natural and the supernatural. For generations, people have reported seeing them. Strange, basketball-sized orbs of light that float and dance in the woods near the summit. The site of a long-abandoned and notoriously deadly strip mine. Skeptics say it's swamp gas, or the headlights of cars from the distant highway, refracted by atmospheric conditions. But those who have seen them up close, those who have been chosen by them, know the truth. They aren't just lights, they are scouts, and they are looking for something. My brother, Kevin, and I were amateur paranormal investigators, which is a fancy way of saying we were two bored kids with a cheap EMF meter and a lot of free time. The Black Mountain Lights were our holy grail. We spent an entire summer hiking up that mountain, night after night, hoping to catch a glimpse of them. For weeks, we saw nothing. We were about to give up, to write the whole thing off as a hoax, when it finally happened. It was a moonless, oppressively humid night. We had set up our gear in a small clearing that overlooked the old, terraced scars of the strip mine. Around 2 a.m., Kevin grabbed my arm, his voice a choked whisper. Look. I followed his gaze. Far below us, near the dark, gaping maw of a collapsed mine shaft, a single, pale blue light had appeared. It hovered for a moment, then began to drift slowly up the side of the mountain towards us. It moved with a strange, deliberate grace, unlike any natural phenomenon. It wasn't flickering. It was a solid, self-contained sphere of cold blue light. As it drew closer, we could see that it was utterly silent. It made no sound, and the woods around it seemed to fall silent as well. The EMF meter in my hand, which had been dormant all night, suddenly shrieked to life, its needle buried in the red. The light stopped about 50 yards from our clearing, hovering just above the ground. It just floated there, pulsing with a slow, rhythmic light, like a deep, silent breath. It felt inquisitive, like it was studying us. We were terrified, but also exhilarated. We were witnessing it. We were proving it was real. Then a second light appeared beside the first, this one a soft, sickly yellow. Then a third, a deep blood red. Within a minute, there were dozens of them, a silent, floating constellation of multicolored orbs, all hovering at the edge of the woods, all silently watching us. We were no longer investigators. We were the exhibit. The lights began to move, not towards us, but in a coordinated, intricate pattern, like a swarm of silent, luminous bees. They swirled and danced, weaving in and out of each other in a display that was both beautiful and deeply, fundamentally alien. It was a form of communication, a language of light and movement that we couldn't possibly comprehend. Kevin, in a moment of sheer, idiotic bravery, took a step forward, raising his camera. "I'm going to get a picture," he whispered. The moment he stepped out of the clearing, the dance stopped. Every single light froze, and then, as one, they all turned to face him. The air grew cold, heavy. The collective attention of these silent, ancient things was a physical force, a pressure that made my ears pop. The blue light, the one that had appeared first, detached itself from the swarm and began to drift slowly towards my brother. "Kevin, get back," I hissed, my voice tight with panic. But he was mesmerized, his camera forgotten. He just stood there, watching the approaching light. The blue orb stopped a few feet in front of him, bathing him in its cold, ethereal glow. It hovered there for a long moment. I saw Kevin's face go slack, his eyes wide and unfocused, as if he were listening to something we couldn't hear. Then the blue light pulsed once, brightly, and shot back to rejoin the swarm. And as one, the entire constellation of lights simply winked out, plunging the mountainside back into an absolute, profound darkness. "Kevin," I called out, my voice trembling. He didn't answer. I fumbled for my flashlight, my hands shaking, and aimed the beam at where he had been standing. He was still there, but he was different. He was standing perfectly still, his head bowed, his arms hanging limply at his sides. "Kev, are you okay?" I asked, walking towards him. He slowly lifted his head, and in the beam of my flashlight, I saw his eyes. They were wide, and they were glowing with a faint, residual blue light. He looked at me, but he didn't seem to see me. He looked through me. He opened his mouth to speak, but the voice that came out was not his. It was a chorus of voices, dozens of them, men and women, young and old, all speaking in a flat, emotionless unison. "The vessel is acceptable," the voices said. "The search is over." Bang. And then he collapsed. I spent the rest of the night dragging my unconscious brother down the mountain. He woke up the next morning in his bed with no memory of the lights, of the voices, of anything that had happened after he'd stepped out of the clearing. He was just Kevin again. But he isn't. Not really. I know the truth. The ghost lights of Black Mountain aren't the spirits of dead miners. They are the miners, or rather, they are what's left of them. Their consciousnesses trapped, their souls converted into these silent, searching orbs of light. And they aren't just haunting the mountain, they are searching it. For decades, they have been patiently, silently, searching for the perfect vessel, a healthy, living body that could house them all, a body strong enough to finally let them walk off that mountain and go home. And that night, they found my brother. They looked inside him, they judged him, and they chose him. He doesn't remember, but I do. I see it sometimes, in the dead of night, when he thinks I'm not looking, a faint blue glow in his eyes. And I know that the search is over, and that my brother is now just a vessel, a quiet walking tomb for the 100 lonely, desperate souls of Black Mountain, who are all just waiting for the right moment to wake up. Story 5. The Toll of the Tommyknockers, the old-timers in the cold town of Redemption. Kentucky had a saying, "You pay the company your wage, and you pay the mountain its toll." The company wage was barely enough to live on. The mountain's toll was much, much higher. The toll was collected by the Tommyknockers, the spirits of the deep earth, the little men who knocked on the walls of the coal seams. Most miners believed they were benevolent, their knocking a warning of a coming collapse, a friendly tap to tell you to get out. My great-grandfather, Jedediah, knew better. He knew the knocking wasn't a warning, it was a bill. Jedediah was a foreman in the Redemption mine, a hard man in a hard business. He was also a man who believed in the old ways, in the superstitions that kept a man alive when black damp and rockfalls were a constant threat. He told a story that was passed down through my family, a story he swore on his own mother's grave was the God's honest truth. It happened during the winter of '47. The mine was on a bad streak. The coal seemed thinning out, the company breathing down their necks for more tonnage. The men were tired, overworked, and taking risks they shouldn't have. Jedediah had a new crew in his section, a group of young, desperate men who were too green to know the difference between the groan of settling rock and the mountain S last breath. One afternoon, the knocking started. It wasn't the usual random creaks of the deep earth. It was a rhythmic, deliberate tap, 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 coming from a new, unexplored seam at the far end of the tunnel. It was the sound the old miners all knew. The Tommyknockers were at work. Jedediah's blood ran cold. He knew what the sound meant. The mountain was about to shift. He ordered his crew to get out, to evacuate the section immediately. But one of the new boys, a cocky kid named Billy, scoffed. "It's just the rock settling, old man," he said. "We're close to a new vein here. I can feel it." He was driven by the promise of a bonus, by the need to feed his young family. He and 2 other greenhorns refused to leave. Jedediah argued with them, pleaded with them, but they wouldn't listen. Their greed was louder than his warning. With a heavy heart, Jedediah led the rest of his crew out of the mine. He told them what was happening, and the older miners just nodded, their faces grim. They knew the rules. You don't ignore the knock. As they reached the surface, a deep, thunderous roar echoed from the belly of the mountain. The ground shuddered. A huge cloud of black dust billowed from the mine entrance. A massive collapse. The section where Billy and the other 2 men had been working was gone, buried under thousands of tons of rock. The rescue operation was a grim formality. They knew there was no hope, but as the foreman, it was Jedediah's duty to lead. the recovery team. They spent 2 days digging through the rubble, the air thick with the metallic scent of death. They finally broke through into a small, uncollapsed pocket, and they found the bodies. But what they saw in that dark, dusty cavern was a scene of such profound, unnatural horror that it broke every man who witnessed it. The 3 miners were dead, crushed by the rockfall. But they hadn't just been killed, they had been caged. They were seated in a circle on the floor of the cavern, their bodies propped up against the rock wall. In the center of the circle was a small, neat pile of gleaming, high-grade anthracite coal, the kind of coal they had been so desperate to find. And in each of the dead miners' hands was a single, perfect, impossibly large gold nugget. Jedediah stared, his mind refusing to process the scene. This wasn't a collapse. This was a transaction. Billy and his men had found their vein, and the Tommyknockers had found theirs. The knocking hadn't been a warning of a collapse. It had been an offer. The mountain had offered them its greatest treasures, its richest coal, its purest gold. But the mountain always collected its toll, and the toll was not paid in money, or in sweat, or even in coal. The toll was paid in life. But the horror wasn't over. As Jedediah stood there, he heard a sound that made his soul turn to ice. Tap, tap, tap. Tappet was coming from the rock wall behind the bodies. But it wasn't just a sound anymore. As he watched, 3 small, childlike handprints, glowing with a faint, phosphorescent light, appeared on the surface of the rock. They were the hands of the Tommyknockers. They had come to admire their payment. Then a new sound, a wet, tearing noise. The bodies of the 3 dead miners began to change. Their skin grew pale and translucent, their limbs thinning, their bodies shrinking. They were being consumed, not by decay, but by the mountain itself. Their life force being drawn into the rock, a final, grim payment to the spirits of the deep. Jedediah and his men fled the mine and never spoke of what they saw. They sealed the section with concrete and dynamite, burying the truth under a mountain of rock and silence. My great-grandfather was never the same after that day. He finished his career, but the joy was gone from his life, replaced by a quiet, haunted fear. He knew the truth that the other miners only suspected. The Tommyknockers weren't guardians. They were gatekeepers. They were the accountants of the deep earth. And they offered a simple, terrible bargain to any miner greedy enough or desperate enough to listen to their knocking. We will give you the riches of the earth, their tapping says. But in return, you must become the riches of the earth. You pay the company your wage, but you pay the mountain and its little knocking collectors with your soul.